When you hear the words Nazi Germany, what do you picture? Bloodthirsty killers burning people in crematoria? The most destructive war in human history? A ruthless machine trying to conquer the world? Now imagine someone tells you that this monster was built not only by fanatics with guns, but also by gray office people in suits, bankers, economists, clerks. One of them was called Hjalmar Schacht. You have probably never heard his name. But without people like Schacht, Hitler's regime would never have been able to build tanks, planes, and armies on the scale it did. Schacht did not sign execution orders. He did not run concentration camps. He only found fuel for the Third Reich's war machine, the money and the financial schemes that made it possible. And once this machine turned outward and started devouring other countries, the whole structure began to shake. This story is about how the Nazi economy really worked, how it rose from the ruins of the Great Depression, why it looked like an economic miracle for a few years, and why it was doomed from the start. Part 1. Birth of the Monster. January 30th, 1933. Night in Berlin. Columns of torchlight crawl through the streets. Stormtroopers in brown uniforms march along the cobblestones. Each synchronized step echoes off the buildings. Swastika flags hang from facades, caught by the beams of searchlights. The crowd roars so loudly that it drowns the sound of marching boots. Over the city echoes. Today, Germany is ours. Tomorrow, the whole world. This is not just a parade. It is a ritual of initiation for a new era. On this night, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. From this moment, the countdown to the bloodiest war in human history begins. But Hitler's rise was not an accident or some strange joke of history. A contemporary German social democrat, Victor Schiff, wrote about it in 1934. He said that Hitler owed his power to the global economic crisis, to unemployed people in despair, to educated young people without a future, to small business owners facing bankruptcy, and to farmers ruined by collapsing prices. The crisis he meant was the Great Depression. Germany and the Great Depression. The Great Depression began in the United States in 1929 with a stock market crash. Within months, it spread all over the world. Imagine that you have $1,000, and 3 years later, the real value of that money is only about $110. That gives a rough idea of how brutal the shock was for the American economy. The U.S. fully recovered only by the mid-1950s. But what does this have to do with Germany? Because by the 1920s, the world had turned into a tightly interconnected financial system. Many countries depended on American loans or actively traded with the United States. When the American economy collapsed, investors pulled their money back home and new credit almost disappeared. Germany was hit especially hard. After losing World War I, the country tried to rebuild by attracting foreign capital. By 1929, Germany had borrowed around 27 billion Reichsmarks from abroad, roughly 36% of its GDP at that time. When foreign creditors suddenly demanded repayment and stopped lending, the consequences were catastrophic. German GDP fell by almost one-third in just 4 years. Unemployment exploded. By the early 1930s, about 1 in 5 Germans had no job. And into this chaos came Adolf Hitler. In the 1930 elections, his party received around 18% of the vote. By 1932, it was already more than 37%, and the Nazis had become the largest force in the Reichstag. Hitler promised something to everyone. Farmers would be protected from bankruptcy. Workers would get jobs, industrialists would receive lucrative contracts, and the military would get a strong army and revenge for Versailles. And the important thing is that these were not just loud slogans. The Nazis began to reshape the economy around a few key pillars. Let's go through them. Pillar 1, winning the countryside at the start of the 1930s, one of the weakest but most numerous groups in Germany were the farmers. Why were they in such a bad position? During the crisis, many countries introduced high tariffs on imported food to protect their own agriculture. As a result, German farmers could mostly sell their products only inside Germany, but ordinary Germans were also poor. Huge queues of unemployed people were standing in front of labor exchanges. Those who still had a job tried to save on everything, food included. To sell anything at all, farmers had to lower their prices again and again. Because of this, total income in agriculture fell sharply. In the late 1920s, farmers earned around 10 billion Reichsmarks a year. By 1932-33, the figure had dropped to about 6.5 billion. Many farms were heavily indebted. Because they had also borrowed money in the relatively prosperous 1920s, the Nazis exploited this very skillfully. There was a propaganda poster showing 3 possible futures for a farmer. Under the caption, "How It Was," a bailiff stands at the gate of a farm, coming to seize property for unpaid debts. Under "How It Might Be Bolshevism," Nazi artists drew terrifying pictures of collectivization like in the Soviet Union, and under "How It Should Be," a calm, strong farmer guides a plow under a huge swastika, with sun and order all around. The message was simple: vote for the Nazis and you will keep your land and your dignity. After coming to power, they did keep this promise, but in their own way. The Hereditary Farm Law in September 1933, Germany adopted the Hereditary Farm Law. On paper, it looked like a generous gift. Peasants received plots of land that were declared hereditary holdings. Such a holding could not be sold, could not be divided between heirs, could not be mortgaged or seized for debt, could only be inherited by one heir and only along the male line. The upside was that the farmer supposedly never again had to fear the bailiff. The downside was that he was now effectively chained to his land. He could not freely sell it and move to a city, change occupation, or start a new life somewhere else. Later, the Nazis created the Reich Food Estate. This was a huge organization into which all farmers were forcibly included. Its essence was simple. Every farmer had to sell the entire harvest, except for what the family itself needed to eat, to the state at fixed prices. Free trading on the side became a violation of the law. Why such hard control? The official explanation was that farmers had to be protected from the wild swings of the market so that prices would not suddenly collapse again like in the Great Depression. In reality, the state wanted absolute control over food supplies, from the field to the shop counter. Many farmers, however, greeted the system with relief. After years of chaos and poverty, stable prices and guaranteed buyers looked far better than being at the mercy of an unpredictable market. And the numbers really improved. If in 1932-33 farm income was about 6.5 billion Reichsmarks, then by 1937-38 it had risen to about 10.3 billion, almost back to the pre-crisis level of the late 1920s. So yes, the Nazis did save the countryside, but at the price of turning it into a tightly controlled part of their war machine. Pillar 2. Bringing the workers to heel in 1933. Germany had catastrophic unemployment, about 6 million people, roughly a fifth of the population. Within 4 years, the official number dropped to less than 1 million. For many observers, this looked like a miracle. Propaganda played a role. Posters, radio speeches, calls to national labor duty, slogans about unity and rebuilding. Women were also actively encouraged to work. But slogans and posters alone do not build factories and do not create real jobs. Real employment appears only when the productive sector revives. For that, companies must receive a steady stream of orders. Someone has to buy their products so that they can pay for raw materials, expand production, and hire new people. During the Great Depression, almost nobody could play this role, so the state itself stepped in and became the main customer. In 1932, German public investment was about 2.2 billion Reichsmarks. By 1938, it had grown to around 10.3 billion, almost 5 times more. The question is, where did the money come from? Schacht's trick. MEFO bills here. Hjalmar Schacht showed his magic. Imagine that the state wants to order uniforms for a paramilitary organization. It chooses a supplier, for example, a clothing company, and places a big order. But instead of paying in cash, the company receives a special promissory note issued by a seemingly private firm or via a private bank. These notes, known later as MEFO bills, were guaranteed by the state. Banks accepted them, they paid interest, and their maturity dates could be extended again and again. Once the order was completed, the supplier could bring the bill to a bank and receive cash. The bank would then redeem the bill at the Reichsbank. If needed, the Reichsbank simply created new money for this. At first glance, this looks like ordinary money printing with extra steps. The difference was timing. In normal money printing, money appears in the economy before new goods are created, which pushes up demand faster than supply and leads to inflation. Under Schacht's scheme, money entered circulation only after production was completed. In theory, every new note was backed by new goods or services. Between 1934 and 1938, around 12 billion Reichsmarks worth of these bills were issued. Only about a third of them were ever redeemed at the Reichsbank. The rest circulated among firms as a kind of shadow currency inside the military-industrial complex. This allowed Germany to secretly finance large rearmament programs, delay obvious inflation, hide the true size of military spending from foreign observers and even from its own statistics. Factories received orders and money, workers received jobs and wages, and the economy really seemed to be recovering. But there was a price for workers: crushing independent unions. To employers, state-funded growth was wonderful as long as workers did not interfere. Independent trade unions, the organizations that had traditionally fought for higher wages and better conditions, were banned. In their place, the Nazis created a single, party-controlled structure: the German Labor Front. Strikes were outlawed. Collective bargaining disappeared. Through the Labor Front, the state and industrialists could coordinate wages and working conditions across the entire economy. Wages remained suspiciously stable and relatively low. In 1935, another tool of control appeared: labor books. These were documents recording a worker's experience and skills. The important twist was that the book was kept not by the worker but by the employer. If someone wanted to quit and find another job, they needed their labor book. An employer could simply refuse to hand it over. Without it, it was almost impossible to get a new official job. In practice, this tethered workers to their current workplace. Why was there no mass rebellion? Because for many people, the alternative looked much worse. They remembered unemployment and hunger from the early 1930s. Now they had a job, a paycheck, some stability, and even cheap holidays organized by Nazi mass organizations. Thanks to state contracts and full employment, official unemployment almost disappeared by 1939. Many saw it as a triumph of economic genius. In reality, it was a war economy disguised as a social miracle. The war economy from the beginning. Hitler himself was not an economist, and his financial knowledge was limited. But the system he built had one central purpose: preparing for war. The background was the Versailles Treaty after World War I. Under it, Germany was limited to an army of 100,000 soldiers, could not have tanks, a real air force, submarines, and many kinds of heavy weapons, was forbidden to develop or trade. Certain armaments had to pay large reparations, had to accept international inspections that monitored compliance. At the same time, a strong desire for revenge and revision of Versailles existed in German society. Nazi propaganda constantly played on this theme. Schacht's financial schemes allowed Germany to rearm without showing it openly. But weapons are not made of money alone. The country needed technologies and raw materials, many of which it did not have. Here, foreign capital and cooperation, including from former enemies, became crucial. Pillar 3. Foreign capital and autarky. After World War I, almost all of Europe was in debt to the United States. European countries owed around $12.5 billion to the U.S. for wartime loans. Germany, in turn, had to pay about $33 billion in reparations to these very European countries. From the American point of view, it was simple. If Germany's economy recovered, it could pay reparations to Britain, France, and others, and they could then pay back the United States. Therefore, in the 1920s, American banks and companies actively loaned money to Germany. Between 1925 and 1930, Germany received almost 7 billion Reichsmarks in American credits. National income grew by more than a third, and German industrial output climbed so high that by the late 1920s, the country had overtaken Britain and France. Becoming second only to the U.S., the Great Depression changed everything. American capital flowed back home, new loans dried up, and Germany fell into a deep crisis. This experience taught Hitler a lesson. Dependence on foreign capital could be fatal. Currency control. In 1936, Germany introduced strict currency control and a policy often described as monetary autarky. The Reichsmark was no longer freely exchangeable for foreign currencies. All foreign exchange earnings from exports had to be handed over to the Reichsbank. Exporters received Reichsmarks instead. Suppose the Swiss branch of General Motors buys components from Opel in Germany. It pays in Swiss francs but not directly to Opel. The francs go to the Reichsbank. Opel receives Reichsmarks at an official exchange rate. The result is that the state accumulates foreign currency and decides what it will be used for, buying oil, metals, grain, and other strategic resources abroad. Foreign-owned companies inside Germany cannot freely take profits out of the country, but they can still earn money and reinvest it domestically in production and technology. As long as the German economy is growing and the state is handing out lucrative military orders, many companies are ready to accept the restrictions. That is why firms such as General Motors, through Opel, Ford, Standard Oil, and others continued to operate in Germany and, directly or indirectly, supported its war effort through technology, fuel, vehicles, and components. Pillar 4. Cartels under state direction to turn industrial capacity into a coordinated war machine. The regime needed more than workers and credit. It also needed to control companies. On the 15th of July 1933, Germany passed a law on compulsory cartels. It gave the Ministry of Economics the right to merge private firms into cartels and syndicates. The cartels could use the courts to force outsiders to join or to drive them out of the market. Big business often likes having monopoly power. Cartels mean less competition, more stable profits, and easier price setting. For the Nazi state, cartels were convenient because the authorities had to negotiate with a few large groups instead of hundreds of independent firms. Refusal was dangerous. The case of aircraft manufacturer Hugo Junkers is a good illustration. In October 1933, he was arrested after resisting cooperation with the Nazis. He stayed under pressure until he surrendered control of his company to the Ministry of Aviation. By the end of the 1930s, nearly all major industrial companies were part of cartels, and very few were not involved in military contracts. By 1939, military spending reached about 23% of German GDP, around 3/4 of heavy industrial production served the needs of the army. In the chemical sector, the giant corporation IG Farben produced synthetic fuel, rubber, and explosives. One of its methanol plants stood next to Auschwitz, which became one of the main symbols of Nazi terror. Part 2. The machine of conquest. By the mid-1930s, Germany's rearmament was not really a secret anymore. Some journalists and diplomats understood what this meant and tried to sound the alarm. One of them was Norman Ebute, Berlin correspondent for the Times. He lived in Germany, had contacts in political circles, including former Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, and saw the mood inside the country. He wrote that influential Germans expected a new European war within 5 to 10 years and saw it almost as something inevitable. But many of his reports were never published or were heavily edited. The British government did not want to provoke Germany, and many major newspapers followed that political line. After the trauma of World War I, British and French elites desperately wanted to avoid another conflict and were ready to close their eyes to many warning signs. This turned out to be a huge mistake. Circumventing Versailles, meanwhile, Germany continued to undermine the Versailles Treaty. The German Air Sports Association officially trained sport glider pilots, but in reality created a reserve of future Luftwaffe pilots. Underwater warfare schools served as cover for training submarine crews. Real submarine projects were carried out in friendly countries such as Finland, where German engineers helped build submarines for the Finnish Navy. These vessels became prototypes for later German designs. Formally, the treaty was not violated. Submarines were built outside Germany, and organizations inside the country were civilian. In practice, Germany was getting ready for naval war. At the Disarmament Conference in Geneva in 1932-33, Germany demanded equal rights. Either other countries had to disarm down to the German level, or Germany should be allowed to arm up to their level. When the Western powers refused, Germany accused them of hypocrisy, and in October 1933 left both the conference and the League of Nations. From that moment, Berlin no longer felt bound by Versailles. In March 1935, Hitler publicly introduced universal conscription and announced the creation of the Luftwaffe. The reaction from the international community was mostly limited to protests and expressions of concern. Britain even signed a naval agreement allowing Germany to rebuild a fleet up to a certain fraction of British tonnage. The message was clear: the League of Nations had no real power, and the main states were not ready to enforce Versailles by force. The 4-year plan in 1936. At the Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, the regime announced a 4-year plan. The goals were openly stated. First, the German army had to be ready for war within 4 years. Second, the German economy had to be fully mobilized for war in the same period. From then on, militarization was no longer disguised. Yet the outside world still limited itself mostly to diplomatic notes and mild economic measures. Anschluss of Austria, a core idea of Nazi ideology, was the creation of a Greater Germany that would unite all ethnic Germans under one state. That meant looking at territories of the former German Empire and Austria-Hungary. Austria was a natural target. From 1933 onward, Austrian Nazis, supported by Berlin, carried out propaganda, bombings, and attempted coups. Under constant pressure and the threat of invasion, the Austrian government gradually lost room for maneuver. On the 12th of March 1938, German troops crossed the border. There was no resistance. Austria was annexed in what the Nazis called the Anschluss. Economic motives were strong. Austria had developed steel and engineering industries, deposits of iron ore, magnesite, graphite, coal and non-ferrous metals, and significant gold and foreign currency reserves. At the time of annexation, Austria's foreign currency and gold holdings were equivalent to roughly 2 billion Reichsmarks, about 25 times more than the Reichsbank's own reserves. In one move, Germany gained industrial capacity, raw materials, and a massive injection of hard currency. Czechoslovakia next in line was Czechoslovakia. It was the only genuinely industrialized new state in Central Europe created after World War I, with a strong economy and strategic position between Germany, Poland, Hungary, and the Soviet Union. In the Sudetenland region lived about 3 million ethnic Germans. With direct support from Berlin, the Sudeten German Party organized demonstrations, provocations, and armed clashes. Hitler claimed that Germans in Czechoslovakia were being oppressed and demanded that the Sudetenland be handed over. Prague refused. Then the crisis was moved to the negotiating table in Munich. Britain and France, afraid of war, agreed to sacrifice Czechoslovakia's interests. The Czechoslovak government was not even invited to the talks. In March 1939, German troops occupied the rest of the country. Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. The economic gain for Germany was enormous. The Skoda works and other factories produced tanks, artillery, and ammunition for the Wehrmacht. By 1941, about a third of German tanks were built on Czech designs or on Czech soil. Almost a third of trucks for the army and around 40% of small arms came from former Czechoslovak plants. Czechoslovakia thus became one of the industrial pillars of the German war machine. A system that could not stop by 1938, German military spending had risen to around a quarter of GDP. The structure of the economy had changed dramatically. A huge part of production was now weapons, vehicles, and military infrastructure. If Germany had tried to stop its expansion at this point, the result would likely have been a severe internal crisis. Weapons production would have outstripped demand, while civilian goods were already in short supply. Cutting military orders would mean closing factories, losing profits, and throwing millions out of work. Industrialists were used to huge state contracts. They had little interest in conversion to civilian production, which would be costly and uncertain. So the logic of this system pushed the country further toward war, even without ideology. Nazi ideology simply gave this economic pressure a radical direction. There was, however, a crucial problem: shortages of raw materials. The resource trap. Take a typical late 1930s German tank. Almost every part of it depended on imported materials. The armor and hull required iron ore, of which about 3/4 came from abroad. The engine and electrical systems needed copper. Germany imported about 70% of its copper. Electronics and solder required tin, and in tin, the level of import dependence was around 90%. Fuel was an even bigger issue. Germany's own oil production covered no more than about 10% of demand, despite heavy state support for synthetic fuel and exploration. So Germany had an army, a militarized industry, and an aggressive leadership. But without a stable flow of imported raw materials, the machine would simply stop. The solution chosen by Hitler was straightforward: seize the resources by force. Poland after Austria and Czechoslovakia, attention turned to Poland. The country had coal deposits, developed agriculture and textile industries. An American newspaper even published a map in April 1939 showing Polish resources from the point of view of a possible German invasion. On the 31st of August 1939, one day before the planned attack, Hitler presented Poland with demands that were practically impossible to accept. He wanted the free city of Danzig, a major port that would cut Poland off from key maritime trade routes. and an extraterritorial highway through the so-called Polish Corridor, which would give Germany quick military access between East Prussia and the rest of the Reich. The demands were made in such a way that Poland was almost guaranteed to refuse them. On the 1st of September 1939, German troops invaded. World War II had begun. France after Poland, the next target in the West was France. France possessed strong metallurgical and engineering industries and one of the largest gold reserves in the world. Around 1940, the French central bank held gold valued at roughly $2.47 billion. German reserves, in contrast, were below 200 million, much of it already taken from Austria and Czechoslovakia. On the 10th of May 1940, Germany launched an offensive in the West. France capitulated in just 46 days. The Reich obtained not only territory but also one of Europe's most important industrial bases, and a huge source of resources and money. Allies, neutrals, and suppliers, Germany also relied on allies and formerly neutral states for critical materials. Finland supplied molybdenum and nickel. Molybdenum was essential for armor steel. Finland provided up to a quarter of German imports. Nickel, which protected metal from corrosion, also largely came from Finland, around 87% of Germany's consumption. Sweden, officially neutral, provided a large share of German iron ore imports, sometimes between 43 and 83%, shipped through the port of Lulu and across the Baltic Sea, relatively safe from British intervention. Denmark and Norway were occupied partly to secure these shipping routes and bases for naval warfare. Switzerland did not supply raw materials, but its banks helped convert gold, including gold from looted central banks and victims of the regime, into foreign currency. That money went to buy strategic resources in other neutral countries. Hungary became a political ally and source of bauxite, needed for aluminum in aircraft production. Romania, after signing an agreement with Germany, became the main supplier of oil, at times covering up to 60% of German needs. Even neutral Portugal and Spain played their role by delivering tungsten, vital for armor-piercing ammunition. The pact with the USSR, a special place in this system, belonged to the Soviet Union. In August 1939, Germany and the USSR signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, including a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Together with it, they concluded a large trade agreement. Germany supplied machinery, industrial equipment, and even examples of new weapons. In return, the Soviet Union supplied grain, oil, manganese ore, phosphates, and other raw materials. Given Germany's limited domestic reserves, without such imports, it could wage a high-intensity war for only something like 6 to 16 months. Soviet deliveries significantly extended this period. Until June 1941, the USSR covered a very large share of German import needs in raw materials. Thus, for nearly 2 years, the Soviet Union was one of the key economic partners of Nazi Germany, despite ideological hostility. For Berlin, it was a temporary but extremely important source of resources. For Moscow, it was a way to gain time for its own military buildup. Part 3. Collapse of the empire. Conquering countries is one thing. Maintaining control over them and integrating their economies is another. Imagine that Germany decides to completely integrate occupied Belgium into its own economy. The simplest idea would be to abolish the Belgian franc and replace it with the Reichsmark. As soon as people heard that all prices would now be in Reichsmarks, they would run to exchange offices to swap francs for Reichsmarks. To avoid chaos, the occupiers would need huge amounts of Reichsmarks to exchange at a believable rate. That would mean turning on the printing press at full speed. But wartime Germany's economy was already heavily focused on the military. In 1940, about 38% of German GDP went to war needs. In Belgium after occupation, almost 2/3 of output went to the war. Civilian goods were already scarce. If both countries used the same currency, millions of people would be competing for a shrinking supply of everyday goods. Prices would shoot up, shortages would worsen, and trust in the currency would crumble. To avoid this, Germany kept local currencies, but changed the rules completely. Clearing accounts instead of paying for imports from occupied countries with real money, Germany used clearing accounts between central banks. Here is how it worked in simple terms. A French factory produces engines for German aircraft and ships them to Germany. In a normal situation, Germany would pay the bill in francs or another convertible currency. Under the clearing system, no money crosses the border. The Bank of France records that Germany now owes a certain sum. The Reichsbank records that it owes this to France. The numbers accumulate in accounting books, not in real payments. On paper, Germany owes money to France. In reality, Berlin has no intention of ever paying. One of the designers of this system, Gustav Schlotterer, explained more or less the following to German businessmen in 1940. He said that Germany had subordinated entire countries so that it did not really need to worry about settling debts with them. They would use tricks, deception, and sometimes violence to make other Europeans sell goods to Germany, while Germany would simply keep their claims open and never settle them. By the end of 1944, Germany's obligations through such clearing accounts had risen to nearly 30 billion Reichsmarks, around a quarter of all its wartime military spending. Of course, the creditors were occupied countries that could not enforce repayment. The price of occupation on top of this, occupied countries had to pay for the presence of German troops and the occupation administration. The Netherlands, for example, had to cover costs equal to roughly half of its GDP each year. France was obliged to transfer about 400 million francs per day, around 400 billion per year. Again, almost half of its GDP. At the same time, the Reichsbank's printing presses were working constantly. New money poured into economies where civilian goods were scarce because a huge share of production went to the German war effort. This led to inflation, shortages, and the collapse of normal economic life. By the end of the war, the French franc, for example, had lost most of its purchasing power. Industrial output in many occupied countries declined steadily. By 1945, French industrial production was only around 70% of its pre-war level. In the Netherlands, it had fallen by about half. In Poland, by about a third. Germany, in effect, was consuming the economic potential of conquered territories faster than it could use it. The longer the war lasted, the weaker its own base became. Labor shortages and forced labor. Before the war, Greater Germany, including Austria and Czech lands, had around 86 million inhabitants. But the demographic shock of World War I and the difficult 1920s had left a noticeable gap in the generation that should have been young adults in the late 1930s. Then the war started, and millions of men were drafted. The army grew from more than 4 million soldiers at the beginning of the war to nearly 10 million at its peak. Losses at the front increased year by year. By autumn 1941, there were almost no men between 20 and 30 years old left in civilian jobs. Women already worked in large numbers in factories, agriculture, and services. A total mobilization campaign in 1943 brought about 700,000 additional women into industrial work, but that was not enough. The economy needed millions of extra workers, not hundreds of thousands. The only place where such numbers could be found was occupied Europe. During the war, Germany built one of the largest forced labor systems in history. About 12 million people, prisoners of war and civilians, were used as forced laborers in the Reich. By autumn 1944, in some sectors, up to 40% of workers were prisoners of war or other coerced laborers. Their working conditions were brutal. Malnutrition, long hours, beatings, and exposure to dangerous chemicals or dust were common. The quote of a former worker from the Ruhr mines gives a feeling for it. Endless coal dust destroying lungs, heavy blocks to be broken on a conveyor before they crash down, an inability to stop even for a second, and total exhaustion by the end of the shift. Under these conditions, productivity was significantly lower than that of German workers. On average, it was around 3/4 to 4/5 of the German level. Among the largest groups, Poles and Soviet citizens, it was often even lower because of especially harsh treatment. Thus, even while Germany tried to compensate for its labor shortage by forced mobilization of foreign workers, efficiency declined. Combined with the destruction of factories by bombing and losses at the front, this made it impossible to maintain the previous level of production. The turning point from 1942-43 onward, the strategic situation deteriorated sharply for Germany. On the Eastern Front, the defeat at Stalingrad and the failure at Kursk became turning points. In North Africa, British and American forces defeated the Axis and opened the way for an invasion of Italy. In September 1943, Italy left the war and Mussolini was overthrown. This opened a direct route into southern Europe for the Allies. On the 6th of June 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. A second front was opened, and the war moved onto the territory of the Reich itself. Allies and satellites began to drop out. In September 1944, Finland left the war. Romania changed sides, depriving Germany of its main source of oil. Hungary was occupied by Germany for a time but was eventually lost too. Neutral countries such as Sweden reduced cooperation under Allied pressure. Bombing raids devastated German cities and industrial centers. Transport networks were broken, fuel depots destroyed. By late 1944 and early 1945, the German army often had tanks standing idle because there was simply no fuel to run them. In March 1945, Hitler issued the so-called Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of all infrastructure, factories, power stations, bridges, railways that could fall into Allied hands. His armaments minister Albert Speer quietly sabotaged these orders, fearing that total destruction would condemn Germans to hopeless misery after the war and make any recovery impossible. In April 1945, German forces in Italy, Western Europe, and the Baltics surrendered one after another. On the 30th of April 1945, Hitler committed suicide in Berlin. On the 8th of May 1945, Germany capitulated unconditionally. The Third Reich collapsed, and with it collapsed its war economy. Or what happened to Hjalmar Schacht? Let us return to the man from the beginning of this story. Hjalmar Schacht, the banker and economist who created many of the financial tools for rearmament, also sat on the defendant's bench in Nuremberg. There is a strong argument that his work made World War II logistically possible. Yet on the 1st of October 1946, Schacht was fully acquitted by the tribunal. The Soviet judge insisted that he should be sentenced to life imprisonment. But other judges considered the evidence insufficient. They agreed that Schacht had helped Hitler come to power and had supported rearmament. But they did not find clear proof that he had been a committed supporter of Nazi ideology or directly involved in planning aggressive war after he lost his post. Schacht later defended himself by saying roughly the following. His programs to create jobs and improve trade had been undone by Hitler's obsession with war. He claimed that he helped eradicate unemployment and restore trade balances, but that his attempts to prevent war had failed. After the war, Schacht founded a private banking house in Dusseldorf. He lived until 1970. He may have been acquitted in a court of law, but history is far less forgiving. His name remains tied to the economic foundations of the Third Reich, as a reminder that when professional talent serves a regime bent on destruction, an acquittal in court does not mean acquittal before history. The final breakdown, step by step, the Nazi economic model destroyed itself. Occupation and plunder gave a short-term boost but undermined long-term production in conquered countries. Clearing accounts and unpaid debts allowed Germany to grab goods without paying, but created an unsustainable financial pyramid. Forced labor partially solved the manpower shortage, but with low productivity and enormous human cost. Money printing and gigantic war spending eroded currencies and broke normal markets. Dependence on imported raw materials made the entire structure extremely vulnerable once key suppliers were lost or switched sides. The whole plan depended on one gigantic bet: the successful conquest of the Soviet Union and its vast reserves of land, grain, oil, and minerals. When this bet failed, the engine that Schacht and others had helped build began to sputter. Without new fuel, in the literal and figurative sense, the supposedly miraculous Nazi economy showed its true nature. A parasitic war machine that could grow only by devouring others, and that was bound, in the end, to collapse under its own weight.